I guess you think you know the story. You don't. The real one's much more gory. The phony one, the one you know, was cooked up years and years ago and made to sound all soft and sappy, just to keep the children happy. Mind you, they got the first bit right. The bit where, in the dead of night, the ugly sisters, jewels and all, departed for the palace ball. While darling little Cinderella was locked up in a slimy cellar, where rats who wanted things to eat began to nibble at her feet. She bellowed, "Help!" and "Let me out!" The magic fairy heard her shout. Appearing in a blaze of light, she said, "My dear, are you all right?" "All right?" cried Cindy. "Can't you see I feel as rotten as can be?" She beat her fist against the wall and shouted, "Get me to the ball! There's a disco at the palace. The rest have gone and I am jealous. I want a dress, I want a coach, and earrings and a diamond brooch, and silver slippers, 2 of those, and lovely nylon pantyhose. Done up like that, I'll guarantee the handsome prince will fall for me." The fairy said, "Hang on a tick." She gave her wand a mighty flick. And quickly, in no time at all, Cindy was at the palace ball. It made the ugly sisters wince to see her dancing with the prince. She held him very tight and pressed herself against his manly chest. The prince himself was turned to pulp. All he could do was gasp and gulp. Then midnight struck. She shouted, "Heck! I've got to run to save my neck!" The prince cried, "No! Alas, alack!" He grabbed her dress to hold her back. As Cindy shouted, "Let me go!" the dress was ripped from head to toe. She ran out in her underwear and lost one slipper on the stair. The prince was on it like a dart. He pressed it to his pounding heart. "The girl this slipper fits," he cried. "Tomorrow morn shall be my bride. I'll visit every house in town until I've tracked the maiden down." Then rather carelessly, I fear, he placed it on a crate of beer. At once, one of the ugly sisters, the one whose face was blotched with blisters, sneaked up and grabbed the dainty shoe and quickly flushed it down the loop. Then in its place she calmly put the slipper from her own left foot. Aha, you see, the plot grows thicker, and Cindy's luck starts looking sicker. Next day the prince went charging down to knock on all the doors in town. In every house the tension grew. Who was the owner of the shoe? The shoe was long and very wide. A normal foot got lost inside. Also, it smelled a wee bit icky. The owner's feet were hot and sticky. Thousands of eager people came to try it on, but all in vain. Now came the ugly sisters go. One tried it on. The prince screamed, "No!" But she screamed, "Yes, it fits, whoopee! So now you've got to marry me." The prince went white from ear to ear. He muttered, "Let me out of here." "Oh, no, you don't. You made a vow. There's no way you can back out now." "Off with her head!" the prince roared back. They chopped it off with one big whack. This pleased the prince. He smiled and said, "She's prettier without her head." Then came up sister number 2, who yelled,
Now I will try the show.
"Try this instead," the prince yelled back. He swung his trusty sword and smack! Her head went crashing to the ground. It bounced a bit and rolled around. In the kitchen, peeling spuds, Cinderella heard the thuds of bouncing heads upon the floor and poked her own head round the door. "What's all the racket?" cried Cindy. "Mind your own biz," the prince replied. Poor Cindy's heart was torn to shreds. "My prince," she thought, "he chops off heads. How could I marry anyone who does that sort of thing for fun?" The prince cried, "Who is this dirty slut? Off with her nut! Off with her nut!" Just then, all in a blaze of light, the magic fairy hove in sight. Her magic wand went swoosh and swish. "Cindy," she cried, "come, make a wish. Wish anything and have no doubt that I will make it come about." Cindy answered, "Oh, kind fairy, this time I shall be more wary. No more princess, no more money. I have had my taste of honey. I'm wishing for a decent man. They're hard to find. Do you think you can?" Within a minute, Cinderella was married to a lovely fella, a simple jam maker by trade, who sold good homemade marmalade. Their house was filled with smiles and laughter. They were happy ever after. I was pretty excited for this project. This poem, Cinderella, is Dahl's adaptation in his collection called Revolting Rhymes, which was published in 1982. What really struck me about this poem and these works in the Revolting Rhymes is that they do not stick to the traditional narratives. Sure, they are fairy tales, but they are certainly not sentimental or childish. If you were to read these works out to someone as bedtime stories, the twists and the turns would keep them up all night. And even as adults, there is so much to explore here.
Every little kid knows about Cinderella. I think it's one of the most famous stories throughout history. But it's really hard to act as Cinderella. When I was offered the opportunity and when I heard the name of Roald Dahl, I was really interested because Roald Dahl has a very cynical, mocking edge to his works, and I always wonder what he's trying to convey. And even though his works are meant for children, they're actually quite scary. So you have works like Matilda, The Witches, BFG, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. They are, in terms of appealing to children, it's actually a nightmare. Like, for example, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory features an industrialist who invites random children to come, and then they all die in like elaborately karmic fashion. And then you have The Witches, which features a group of adults who are trying to mass murder children in England. And then, of course, who can forget all the sexual innuendos in Charlie and the Giant Peach?
When I think of this poem, what strikes me most is its shock value. I mean, right at the beginning, Dahl declares that this isn't the Cinderella we grew up with or read fairy tales about. It isn't even remotely Disney, but I believe that that's part of the appeal. It has this cynical, self-aware charm to it. It also has a refreshingly postmodern rejection of fairy tale ideals and messages. You see, Dahl grew up in England during one of the darkest periods in its history and served in the RAF at just age 23. I'm pretty sure that the Second World War would have dispelled every single romantic notion he had had before, and the bitterness that replaced it continued to color his writing throughout his life. In that sense, I think that Dahl is trying to write a Cinderella for the modern age. Not a very didactic Cinderella, but a realistic one. Though he's still very glad to murder the stepsisters.
Sisters are designed to be obstacles rather than people, to serve as foils to Cinderella. Basically, there's very little to Cinderella's character since she's meant to be a stand in for readers to project themselves onto. So rather than giving her a host of likable traits, the story simply surrounds her with heartless people. We see Cinderella suffering and we empathize with her. And this is precisely because she's so passive and ordinary and generically nice. Since we're given no reason to hate her, anyone who causes her pain naturally comes off as a deranged or cruel person. And I think this is what makes Cinderella so relatable, particularly to children from middle and lower class demographics. They engage with Cinderella through her oppression, through her sadness, because they know how it feels to be passed over and to be denied the right validation and attention.
And this element remains consistent through every version of the Cinderella story. According to the Annie Thompson-Uther Index that classifies folk tales based on their traits, it specifically defines Cinderella as an archetypical persecuted heroine story. So it gives audiences a sense of wish fulfillment, and it put forth the idea that birth and wealth are not integral to success. It is the inner virtue of an individual that determines success. Cinderella is patient, and she bears the torments and oppressions of her sisters without being hateful to them or fighting back. So the idea is, if you're kind, if you're gentle, and if you honestly desire something in your life, the universe will reward you. In this case, the fairy godmother was the reward, and she represented the will of nature, magic, and power of childhood dreams. So whenever Cinderella was in some sort of trouble, the fairy godmother would serve as the guardian angel and save her day, making her life a happier life.
What I find interesting about Cinderella is the fact that the fairy godmother gives Cinderella a bejeweled dress, a golden carriage, and glass slippers. Now we know that Cinderella is a good person, she's the nicest kid on the block, but the fairy godmother says that this isn't enough. We need to do something more for you so that the prince recognizes you, so that the prince takes account of you. Now the fundamental moral of Cinderella, the fairy tale, is that moral virtue is more important than material wealth. The stepsisters have better dresses than Cinderella, they're in a better position than her. Cinderella is just a girl who cleans the fireplace. But since she's a much better person than her stepsisters, she becomes the one that the prince chooses. But even though this fairy tale puts forth this ideal, the events of the fairy tale contradict it. Because in order to access the prince, in order to get him to recognize her, Cinderella has to dress beautifully. She has to present herself as a pseudo-princess, as a member of the nobility. And I find this a very interesting contradiction. Unlike in other fairy tales, like Rapunzel or Sleeping Beauty, where the prince just comes across the princess while she's oblivious to him and falls in love with her before she even knows who he is, Cinderella is a story wherein the girl must actively strive to capture her prince, to go after him, to make herself beautiful to him so that he accepts her. And this is what lends the Cinderella its unique identity. And underneath all the fantastical fairy tale elements, I think Cinderella, even the fairy tale, is quite realistic because it basically says that Cinderella's true prison is not some kind of tower or some kind of curse by a witch. Cinderella's true prison is poverty. And the only way she can transcend that, the only way she can escape, is by marrying a rich person in a patriarchal society. The prince has to see her as someone who is noble, as someone who is rich. Because if she just went up to him as she was with her face covered in ashes, he would dismiss her as a filthy peasant commoner. What makes Roald Dahl's version interesting is that it might actually be more idealistic than the original fairy tale. Because Cinderella doesn't get swayed by the prince's wealth. She doesn't just condone the fact that he's a selfish, entitled murderer because marrying him would make her life better. She says, no, I understand that the prince is a toxic person and I am not going to engage with him. I am going to stand up for my principles, for my beliefs and for my ideas. And in this regard, Cinderella chooses to marry someone who might not be as rich or as affluent but is a much better match for her personally. And so Roald Dahl emphasizes the moral of Cinderella, that your inherent ethical virtue is much more important than material wealth. Just as the stepsisters are rejected in favor of the poor yet virtuous Cinderella, so is the selfish but rich prince rejected in favor of a humble but supportive jam maker.
And the fact that Cinderella makes a choice is what's really interesting here. Like in many variations of the poem, of the story, you will realize that Cinderella is a sweet, patient little girl who, who depends on this godmother ex machina to help her out. And even at the ball, she runs away when her time is up. And for her own happy ending, it's the prince who comes and saves her. She does not make any effort. So she's this ideal, forgiving woman who's dependent on fairies and princes to make her dreams come true, and who just suffers from, who just shifts from absolute suffering to immense joy in the blink of an eye, which does not really happen in real life. And Dahl very pertinently pointed out that the prince who falls in love at first sight will probably be a privileged man-child, a very violent man-child, rather than some grand saint who is trying to uplift a lower-class girl from poverty. And the fact that in this poem that Cinderella recognizes this and she very maturely marries someone with whom she knows she will have a better understanding is what makes this poem really beautiful.
The brilliant part is how Dahl foreshadows this. Cinderella's gorgeous dress does not vanish at midnight. It's torn by the prince. Her iconic glass slipper isn't used to find her. It gets flushed down a toilet and is replaced with an ordinary one. In the original fairy tale, as we all know, the godmother transforms Cinderella's rags into a beautiful gown, and the rats into horses, and the rotten pumpkin into a golden carriage. This represents her transformation and her awakening of true self. But the destruction of these symbols is the destruction of Cinderella's old personality, her naivete, and her romantic notions, along with her foolishness. And what rises from the ashes is a more mature, intelligent woman. The prince realizes this, and he even strives to kill Cinderella when she criticizes him. He calls her a slut because she has rejected the virginal, submissive persona of a child.
But the arrival of the fairy godmother the second time confirms that this part of her persona is just as valid and just as worthy of wishing. In the first wish, Cinderella pursues material wealth, but in the second wish, she pursues her happiness that is based on her intelligence. This intelligence of hers gets her happily ever after. She refuses to marry the prince because he is deranged and unstable, and instead chooses to marry a jam maker who is modest and secure. So you might think in the first glance that Dahl is cynical and brutal about Cinderella, but no, he's actually trying to integrate the uneven mixture of idealism and realism, making it a better version of Cinderella. You are shocked into laughing at the brutality of it all, because he tricks you down into an alley of thought and suddenly you are tossed into another alley of thought. This poem is perfectly synchronous of contradictions that exist to evoke nuanced thinking and making this experience or this atrocity a schadenfreude. This sing-song-like and whimsical-like rhythm makes it less free and less elaborate. But this is what makes Dahl's work, Cinderella, work on different levels as a guilty pleasure, body coloring of fairy tales, and lastly, a mature meditation on the various roles and expectations of women in narratives like this.
I still can't get over the way Dahl has the stepsisters murdered in the poem. And if you go to see, in nearly every single version of the Cinderella story, the stepsisters seem to suffer from a really terrible fate. For example, in the Grimm's version, the stepsisters hack off their heels and their toe so that their feet can fit into the slipper. In the old Chinese version, known as Yi Zhan, the stepsister is bludgeoned to death by flying rocks. And in the Vietnamese version called Tam and Cam, a stepsister is killed by the heroine, turned into a stew, which is then fed to the evil stepmother, who consequently dies of shock when she realizes that she's eaten one of her own children. Only in the classic French version, the Perrault version on which the Disney movie is based, has Cinderella forgive her family because she always wanted her stepsisters and her stepmother to love her. Although Cinderella is really ill-treated by her stepsisters, it's also really sad to see how desperately they strive to catch the prince's attention. Because unlike Cinderella, they are not going to get a magical solution to all their problems. Perhaps they never really loved the prince. Perhaps they just wanted to escape from a life of poverty and subjugation by marrying the prince. Dahl, however, doesn't humanize the stepsisters. He simply labels them the ugly sisters and plays their deaths for comedy. I do believe that seems to undermine a bit of the feminist subtext.
In the end, I guess we can say that the moral of Roald Dahl's Cinderella is that purity and kindness is not always repaid in kind, and there's a glaring lack of Prince Charmings. One needs to be sensible and think things through, rather than depend on a happily ever after which arrives from palaces and royal families. When one thinks of it, Roald Dahl's Cinderella did not thrive in her story. She actually survived it. And that's the best any of us can do, really.